The Great Bengal Famine. 6.1. A brief outline. The official Famine Inquiry Commission reporting on the Bengal famine of 1943 put its death toll at about 1.5 million. W.R. Ackroyd, who as a member of the commission was primarily responsible for the estimation, has said recently, "I now think it was an underestimate, especially in that it took little account of roadside deaths, but not as gross an underestimate as some critics of the Commission's report, who preferred 3 to 4 million, declared it to be." In fact, it can be shown that the Commission's own method of calculation does lead to a figure around 3 million deaths. And there will be an occasion to go into this demographic issue in Appendix D. But, for the present purpose, it does not really matter which of the estimates we accept. Our chief concern here is with the causation of the Bengal famine, and in particular with the role of food supply and that of exchange entitlements in the genesis of the famine. First, a bit of background. There are 3 rice crops in Bengal. One, Aman, sown in May and June, harvested in November and December, the winter crop. 2, Aus, sown around April and harvested in August and September, the autumn crop. And 3, Boro, planted in November and harvested in February and March, the spring crop. The winter crop is by far the most important, and the respective shares of the 3 crops during the 5 years 1939 to 43 were 73, 24, and 3%. In 1942, the autumn crop was a little less than normal, 97% of the preceding 4 years, and the winter crop quite a bit less, 83% of the average preceding 4 years. This was largely the result of a cyclone in October, followed by torrential rain in some parts of Bengal and a subsequent fungus disease. Further, the Japanese occupation of Burma in 1942, Rangoon fell on the 10th of March 1942, cut off rice imports from there, which affected the supply to Bengal. Since the famine hit Bengal in 1943, it is quite natural, in view of the cyclone, flooding, fungus diseases, the disruption of the war, and the loss of Burma rice, that its primary cause should be seen as, quote, the serious shortage in the total supply of rice available for consumption in Bengal, as compared with the total supply normally available. The Famine Inquiry Commission. This thesis will be examined presently. The wholesale price of rice, which had been about 13 rupees to 14 rupees per mound, about 82.3 pounds, on the 11th of December 1942, rose to 21 rupees by the 12th of March 1943, and to above 30 rupees by the 21st of May. By the 20th of August, it had risen to 37 rupees. Because a government order fixing a maximum price, quotations for price transactions are difficult to obtain from September 43 onwards, but there are non-official reports of further rises, especially in retail markets, such as in October that rice was being sold in Chittagong at 80 rupees per mound, and in Dhaka at 105 rupees per mound. The economic experience of Bengal leading to and during the famine can be split into 3 phases. Phase 1, from the beginning of 1942 to March 1943. Phase 2, from March 1943 to November 1943. Phase 3, from November 1943 through most of 1944. The death rate reached its peak only in Phase 3, but the most acute period of starvation had by then passed, epidemics were raging in a famine-devastated country. Phase 2 is when the starvation death reached its peak. In contrast, what I am calling Phase 1 is usually taken to be a period when the famine had not yet begun. In a sense, that view is correct, since starvation deaths were still relatively rare. But the economic distress that paved the way for the famine had already gripped a substantial part of the population. The famine revealed itself first in the districts away from Calcutta, starting early in 1943. Its progress can be watched in the reports of the commissioners and district officers all over the province, beginning with descriptions of hunger marches organized by communists on the 28th of December 1942. A selection of reports include people having to go without food, 10th of February, indications of distress among local people, 27th of February, acute distress prevails, 26th of March, crime against property increasing and paddy looting cases have become frequent, 28th of March, major economic catastrophe apprehended, 27th of April, economic conditions approaching a crisis, 13th of May, bands of people moving about in search of rice, 12th of June, deaths in streets, 12th of June, town filled with thousands of beggars who are starving, 17th of July, passing through the most acute stage of distress, 10th of August, deaths still occurring, 9th September, disposal of dead bodies a problem, 27 December. Supplies arriving, but no hope of saving those who are starving, 25th October. Mortality reached its peak only in December 1943 and stayed up for quite a while longer, but this was mostly the result of famine-induced epidemics of cholera, malaria, and smallpox, for instance. Death directly from starvation and famine diarrhea had passed its peak in late summer and autumn of 1943. The experience was quite different in Calcutta. The official policy was based on the firm conviction that, quote, the maintenance of essential food supplies to the industrial area of Calcutta must be ranked on a very high priority among the government's wartime obligations. And as early as August 1942, the Bengal government had explained to the Bengal Chamber of Commerce that as far as Calcutta was concerned, the government promised to, quote, do all in their power to create conditions under which essential supplies may be obtainable in adequate quantities and at reasonable prices. The Bengal Chamber of Commerce Foodstuffs Scheme, guaranteeing essential items of food to the grain shops of industrial concerns connected with the chamber, came into existence with the government's help in August 1942. It covered 620,000 employees by December of that year. The other chambers of commerce developed similar schemes with government backing, covering about 170,000 employees. Public arrangements for provision of supplies to those employed by the central and provincial governments, the railways, the Port Trust, and the Calcutta Corporation covered another 300,000 employees. These schemes granted freedom from starvation to more than 1 million employees and their dependents. In addition, controlled shops were started in Calcutta in August and September 1942, supplemented in 1943 by a scheme of approved markets, by which government stocks were made available to selected private shops for sale to the public. The government helped to feed Calcutta through 3 successive schemes of procurement at controlled prices between December 1942 and March 1943, but since they did not prove to be very successful, free purchase at market prices was resumed in the districts from March 1943, leading to very sharp rises in the price of rice in the districts. Calcutta saw the famine mainly in the form of masses of rural destitutes, who trekked from the districts into the city. By July 1943, the streets were full. To start with, relief was confined to personal charity and to kitchens organized by charitable organizations. But by August, relief for destitutes in Calcutta was accepted as an official policy. While cautious parsimony prevailed, meals were given at the same time of day in all kitchens to prevent destitutes from getting more than one meal. There is little doubt that a destitute who had found his way into Calcutta had a much better chance of survival than anywhere else in Bengal. Nevertheless, since the relief offered was quite inadequate, unattended dead bodies could be found everywhere in the city. 3,363 dead bodies had to be disposed of by relief organizations in October alone. The number of starving and sick destitutes in Calcutta was estimated to be at least 100,000 in October. A decision was taken by the end of the month to remove the destitutes from the city. The Bengal Destitute Persons Repatriation and Relief Ordinance, passed on 28th of October, was a rather controversial piece of legislation, since it was alleged that repatriation was rather more firmly achieved than relief in the many destitute homes and camps set up outside Calcutta. For Calcutta, however, the worst of the famine was over, and the death rate came down sharply. In fact, the situation in the districts also eased as some relief reached there directly, in with the harvesting of a good autumn crop and an outstanding winter one. The continued increase in the death rates in the districts was largely the result of famine-induced epidemics. 6.2. A food supply crisis? The most common approach to famines is to propose explanations in terms of food availability decline, or FAD. This FAD approach has been used extensively to analyze and explain the Bengal famine. The Famine Inquiry Commission's view that the primary cause of the famine was a serious shortage in the total supply of rice available for consumption in Bengal provides the standard explanation of the famine. As Blinn notes in his authoritative account of agricultural trends in India, referring to the report of the Famine Inquiry Commission into the Census of India in 1951, writes, "In 1942 to 43, cyclones and floods reduced the Bengal rice crop by about a third. This, coupled with the absence of exports from Japanese-controlled Burma and inadequate relief, led to famines, epidemics, malaria, cholera, and smallpox, aggravated by widespread starvation." But is this explanation really supported by the facts, even by data to be found in the body of the report of the Famine Inquiry Commission itself? First, consider what the Commission calls the current supply for a given year, obtained by adding the winter crop of the preceding year, harvested in December and usually sold in the following 3 months, to the spring and autumn crops of the year in question, plus net imports. Calculated from data given in the report of the Famine Inquiry Commission, these are presented in columns below. While 1943 was not a very good year in terms of crop availability, it was not, by any means, a disastrous year either. The current supply for 1943 was only about 5% lower than the average of the preceding 5 years. It was in fact 13% higher than in 1941, and there was of course no famine in 1941. However, certain further calculations are needed before the FAD view can be rejected. Our first correction: adjustment of official production estimates. The official estimates of agricultural production in India have been criticized for a long time, for instance by P.C. Mahalanobis. Among recent contributions, Blinn provides fairly comprehensive estimates of agricultural trends in India, though yield data are not given separately for Bengal, only for Greater Bengal, which includes Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. But the picture of a better food production situation in 1943 compared with 1941 is confirmed. Even the rice yield per acre, which is given separately for the Bengal province, is shown to have been higher in the year 1942 to 43 than in 40 to 41, despite the fact that the acreage in 1942 to 43 was known to be much higher than in 1940 to 41. Some corrections to the official estimates were carried out by the Famine Inquiry Commission itself, on the line suggested by Mahalanobis and others. These included corrections also to the trade data to increase coverage of movements across the frontier by road or by country boat. The Commission's adjusted figures from their Statement 3 are presented in columns below. Once again, the 1943 column figure for current supply is not exceptionally low, and is higher than that for 1941. Our second correction: changes in wheat imports. While rice is by far the dominant food in Bengal, wheat is also consumed in considerable amounts, so that food grains availability should reflect variations in both rice and wheat. Very little wheat is grown in Bengal, but a fair amount is imported. The net imports of wheat and wheat flour into Bengal by rail and riverborne trade for 1938 to 43 are calculated from accounts relating to the inland, rail, and riverborne trade of India, a then current monthly publication of the Department of Commercial Intelligence and Statistics. These statistics do not, however, include road-based trade. The Famine Inquiry Commission's figure of net arrivals in Bengal in 1943 is 36% higher than the rail and river net imports, in its statement that in the 5 years ending 1941 to 42 in Bengal, imported from outside the province an average of 21,000 tons a month, makes the total for this period 33% higher than the total of the rail and river net imports. To cover the gaps in the trade statistics from the rail and river data, these amounts have been raised by 36% to get the total net imports of wheat into Bengal. This is almost certainly an overestimate for 1941 vis-a-vis 1943, but this is an acceptable bias as it favors the thesis we are rejecting. The rice and wheat current supply figures are given in columns below. The supply in 1943 was 11% higher than in 1941. Our third correction: per capita supply. Since population of Bengal was growing over this period, the availability figure must be scaled down correspondingly to arrive at an index of per capita availability. The annual rate of natural increase in population in West Bengal was calculated to be 0.46% per year during 1941 to 50 in the Census of India, but this is an underestimate for our period, since the decade average reflects the impact of the famine itself. Also, the 1941 figure was acknowledged to have been overstated owing to excessive registration of both the Muslim and Hindu communities to exaggerate their respective strengths in pre-partition India. A figure of 1% per year is, however, a reasonably safe overestimate, and it is chosen here with a bias in favor of the thesis to be rejected. In the last column of Table 6.2, the per capita indices of food availability, rice and wheat, are presented with an assumed population growth of 1% per year. Again, with 1941 being taken as a standard index of 100. The per capita availability index for 1943 is about 9% higher than that for 1941. Our fourth correction. Late availability of imported food in 1943. It can be argued that the availability of food grains was particularly bad in the earlier part of 1943. Imports of rice and wheat were rather lower then, and rose sharply in the last quarter of 1943. While the death rate seems to have reached its peak only in December 1943, there is evidence that starvation was at its peak in the third quarter of 1943. During the last quarter of 1943, Bengal imported 100,000 tons of rice, as opposed to an average of 55,000 tons per quarter earlier in the year, and 176,000 tons of wheat, as opposed to an earlier average of 54,000 tons. To bias the figures as much as possible against 1943, the extra amounts of rice and wheat imports during the last quarter of 1943 over the averages for the three previous quarters may be simply deducted from the total 1943 figure. This yields a current supply of rice and wheat of 9.068 million tons in 1943, with an index value of 109 of food grain supply and of 107 of per capita food grains availability. The former is thus fully 9% higher, and the latter nearly 7% larger than the values for 1941, for which no deduction whatsoever for the last quarter is made. Our fifth correction, the so-called carryover of old rice. The figures presented so far take no account of the carryover stock from before the December harvest of the previous year. The Famine Inquiry Commission thought that one cause of the famine was a shortage in the stock of old rice carried forward from 1942 to 43. Indeed, it argued that the carryover was substantially smaller than in 1941, and gave this an important role in precipitating the famine. But it gave no data on this. And as Mr. M. Afzal Hussain, a member of the commission, noted in his minute, absolutely no data are available regarding the stock position of rice or any other food grain from month to month or year to year in Bengal or any other part of India. The Commission's majority view that the carryover at the beginning of 1943 was probably sufficient for about 6 weeks' requirements is just as much a pure surmise as is Hussain's view that the carryover in the sense of surplus overconsumption must have vanished years ago. A reasonable way of looking at the carryover problem in the absence of direct information is to examine moving averages over 2 or 3 years ending in the year in question.
Hear me. New law in the city.
This will indicate the build-up to the year under examination. Moving averages for 2-year and 3-year periods are given in rows below. As it happens, the 2-year average ending in 1943 is the highest in the series of total food grains availability, hardly the build-up for a famine. The 3-year average ending in 1943 takes a dip from the preceding average, but it is still of the same order of magnitude as the average ending in 1941. Indeed, it is just a bit higher. For per capita figures, even with our deliberately raised population growth assumption, the 3-year average ending in 1943 is only just a shade lower than the ending in 1941. And the 2-year average ending in 1943 is in fact quite a bit higher than that for 1941. It seems safe to conclude that the disastrous Bengal famine was not the reflection of a remarkable overall shortage of food grains in Bengal.